This is the Aurelius Podcast, episode 49 with Nate Bolt. I'm Zach Naylor, co-founder at Aurelius and your host for the Aurelius Podcast, where we discuss all things UX, research, and product. In this episode, we have Nate Bolt. He's the founder and CEO of Ethnio, the UX research, participant, and recruiting platform. His background also includes being a founder at Bolt Peters, a UX research agency that eventually got acqui-hired by Facebook, where he then became a design research manager. And if that's not enough, Nate also co-authored the book on remote research. As you would expect, Nate and I talked about remote research a fair bit. Being in the middle of a global pandemic forced a lot of teams to do more or exclusively remote research. We touched on some of the challenges in remote research, but also how things have changed from when he first co-authored the book. Our chat also turned to discussing some differences and overlap with market research. From there, we talked about one of the biggest challenges researchers face, which is backing up your findings and getting business partners or stakeholders to accept and act on your insights. From there, we also touched on a growing topic of the responsibility we all have as researchers on the world we're shaping and the impact we're having. Really great stuff from someone who's been in our field for a long time. The Aurelius Podcast is brought to you by Aurelius, the powerful research repository and insights platform. Aurelius is an all-in-one space for researchers to organize notes, capture insights, analyze data, and share outcomes with your team. We recently announced two of our biggest features yet. Aurelius now offers transcriptions and our automatic report builder. You can add any audio or video recording and have notes created for you automatically. Then, Aurelius automatically creates a report with every key insight and recommendation from your project, which you can then edit, design, and share with anyone right from Aurelius. Check us out at aureliuslab.com. That's AURELIUSLAB.com. Okay, let's get to it. Hey, Nate.
Howdy.
How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, not bad. We were chatting a little bit here. Just with everything going on, we're hoping that the world can kind of settle and maybe we can all focus and get back to some semblance of a normal life pretty soon here.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I mean, we'll be releasing this in the future. So for future population, when you hear this, I mean, hopefully things have gotten better and not worse by that point, right? So I want to thank you again for jumping on here and taking the time to chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, as with a lot of these episodes, I think selfishly, they're people who I tend to want to talk to and have conversations with, right? And that makes a really good podcast. But for folks who maybe are not familiar with you and the work you've done and sort of your background, I think it would be great to share a little bit about who you are, what you've done, what you're passionate about.
Sure. I had a UX research agency in San Francisco for a while called Bolt Peters. And then we were kind of acqui-hired by Facebook. And then I was there for a couple of years. And then I went and have been focusing on Ethnio since then, which is like a participant management platform. And along the way, co-wrote a book on remote research and done a few articles and things like that. And some weird videos. Yeah,
very good. Remote research is one of those things where I feel like a lot of people know you from among your very broad background, but I think that's still one that a lot of folks kind of know you from, and it's very timely right now, right? Because of everything that has been going on and kind of ongoing, even with the pandemic, and a lot of people realizing or forced to have to do remote research.
Yeah, totally. It's funny. I mean, it was already kind of becoming much more common, and this definitely accelerated things.
And I got to ask, other than we're in some really uncharted territory, I think, in the world, in our industry, right? Just as a result of the global pandemic and stuff. But one of the things I wanted to ask you is how have things changed since you really sort of wrote the book on remote research? Because back then there's a lot more restrictions that we sort of don't have today. I'm kind of curious, what's the biggest thing that you've seen change with remote research between now and then?
Well, I mean, it's just become so much more accepted. At that time, it was still kind of like an uphill battle to convince people on not necessarily the validity, but like maybe the feasibility of doing different kinds of things remote. And now it's just research, just drop the remote. Like, I feel like every team, even prior to the pandemic, had some component of remote stuff. And now, whether it's tools or just people getting used to it or need for it, it's so much more popular. So that's the number one thing. It was still kind of fringe when we started the book.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember reading the book and I was like, man, I just wish we could get the right tools or get people to feel comfortable doing this, right. And I think, at least for me, and I don't know how true this is for you or anybody else you've spoken with, back then it was like remote mobile research was just the real challenge. It was, there were ways to do it, and you covered that, over time. but it seems so difficult, where now there's companies and tools and stuff that completely specialize in that seem really, really solid.
Totally, which is awesome. I think that's what I was sort of hoping, and I think seemed likely, but it takes time.
Yeah, for sure. So, with all that, you've had a lot of remote research conversations. What's the number one thing people still want to come and ask you about that? Maybe even especially in light of it now, where we're all kind of forced to do research remotely.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a tie. I think it's a two-way tie. One is around the challenges for a specific study. Here's my X challenge to do this remotely. How can I do that? Whether it's like hardware that you would maybe need to ship to people, or if it's like a legal challenge, like something around consent or a special population, some kind of tricky situation that's not your average, sort of no-brainer remote, like, yeah, we'll just put people in a Zoom meeting and call it a day. Like that kind of garden variety remote, I think, is so common now that whatever tool you're using, there's a way to do it. That first spot in the most common sort of question is, I've got this X scenario. And I find those super interesting, and it's never ending. I mean, it's just like study design in general. There's always some unique element to it. So that's one. And then the second is just tools. I still think that tools is the biggest topic, because, you kind of have Zoom as like reigning champ, because it's just become so dependable, and like this whole weird pandemic, poster company.
Yeah.
But even outside of that, I think that space, whether it's mobile stuff or desktop or specialized note-taking or research repositories or the participant recruiting, having that over the last few years kind of scoot over to remote, teams and individuals of every scale are interested in tools. So I think that's the second most common thing that I see people talking about. It's like, what's the best tool for X? Or here's my unique challenge for X.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I mean, so we went from a situation where there were none. I mean, I remember some of the things you called out in the first edition of the book. It was like
so old, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was us doing the best we could with what was available. And now, like you said, you almost have a choice of which of these tools specific to your need would you like to use. And that's just such a huge change, right? In terms of what's available.
Totally. And a lot of the complexity now is like making sense of the landscape of tools and trying to pick the right one.
Yeah, actually, and we get that a lot, just being the nature of who we are, right? And I'm sure you do as well with Ethnio and sort of that side of the world. But we, as an industry, we like tools a lot, I think, too. I think that's part of it. It's not just that things have matured. I think for some reason we love tools. I don't know if I've ever really figured out why that's the case. It's
an interesting question. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think if you're talking about the qual side, there's always sort of unknown factor when you're talking about humans and the logistics around scheduling humans. And it's not like an entirely computer-based thing. And anytime that's in the mix, I think that there's complexity and never-ending complexity. And so there maybe tools are a way for us to help ease that, or sort of codify that process or whatever. But who knows? I mean, that's just like a baloney guess.
That's all right. It's all valid here. I mean, none of us know the future, right? I'm kind of curious, though. I mean, so kind of on that note, none of us know the future, but I'm curious, do you have a sense for it? Do you have a prediction of like how things will change once the pandemic kind of gets under control and we're able to do more in-person research? Do you think, or do you expect to see people still doing a lot more remote research than they were before the pandemic? Or do you think it's going to go back to us sort of preferring to have things in person?
It's a great question. I do think that there will be a lasting increase of the pie in remote stuff, especially for UX research. Market research, much bigger beast, more complicated. I don't know about that. For the UX side of the fence, there's so many large organizations and even governments that were not allowed by the lawyers to do remote stuff. And that all changed in an instant. And so I think a lot of those organizations and teams wanted to, maybe not all, but at least have a component of their research be remote for a bunch of different reasons. And that's not going anywhere, because I think as long as the lawyers aren't going to like change their mind, or security, maybe both security and legal, once it's like approved, I don't see that getting revoked for those types of places that were still, even up till the pandemic, like, we'd love to, but we're not allowed for XYZ reason. And then boom, all of a sudden it's allowed.
Yeah, that's really, really great point that you brought up. And this was something I was actually talking about even at sort of a global society level, is that when when the pandemic really hit full swing, I was saying this has shown how a lot of things we all thought we couldn't do and all the reasons why. It showed us that with the right motivation that we can actually change anything we want pretty easily with the right motivation and the right sort of folks on board. And you're right. It's a really great point. It's just once you've opened Pandora's box to that, I don't think there's ever closing it. Right now, we've seen that the world can operate this way. There's pros to it. There's cons. We're all sort of still struggling with that. Right. But I think that we get to make a choice on that now, which is really cool. I think that we get to keep the pros out of it.
Yeah. And I think that it just further probably eroded a bit of the thinking of it as such a different thing. Remote research just became research. So now it's just, I don't think it's something people even explicitly think about as some big difference. It's just like, this is the stuff we do in person. This is the stuff we do remote. It's not, there's no big conversation about that part anymore, unless you're prohibited by like specialized hardware or one of the many reasons. I think if you're dealing with specialized hardware, for example, you're like kind of dying to be able to do in-person stuff because it's such a huge problem to ship some beta hardware product to someone that's not supposed to have it yet. And, that probably is not going to change anytime soon. But
yeah, I didn't even think of that. I mean, there's huge challenges there just in terms of confidentiality and everything else. And not to mention, like if you're giving somebody a widget that they hold in their hands and something goes wrong, you can't necessarily help. Right. Everything's wasted, right?
Right. You can't have the engineers jump in and tweak it or something. Yeah, all that stuff.
Yeah, that would be really difficult. And actually makes me think of something else. I mean, I'm curious, do you have opinions or experience in saying, hey, this is the kind of research that you ought to actually focus on doing remotely because there's benefits to doing that way. It's much easier to kind of conduct and execute and get the most out of, as opposed to then the other end of the spectrum. Do you have research where you're like, I don't know that I recommend you try to do that remotely?
Yeah, probably. I mean, it's dependent on so many variables. It kind of actually, it sort of highlights the reason why I've never been too interested in like a second edition of the book. Mm-hmm. And that's something I'm so embarrassed about when people still read it today and they're like, what's GoToMeeting? And I'm like, oh, that was like 50 years ago. Sorry. I'm so sorry. That was like the thing in the book. But you need some amount of inputs from the researcher or research team to answer that question well. And it's like, well, what kind of org are you? And like, what's your audience like? And what are your research goals? Like, what are you testing? And then like, okay, then let's like map out what the right fit is for that context. But it's not that many. It's like 7 inputs or something. So I think speaking of being tool obsessed, I always thought about doing a better job of just gathering some inputs to be able to say, for X scenario, this is what you should look into. But that's hard to do well. And, it's a lot different beast than just writing up a book.
Fair enough. You touched on something in one of your answers to an earlier question. You said, especially on the UX side of the fence, like UX research, whereas maybe market research is different. I kind of we've touched on this topic in the podcast in the past. I want to ask as someone, especially with your company, Ethio, who kind of helps serve both of those markets, what's the big difference there to you, UX research versus market research?
Yeah, a big topic, of course. I mean, on the surface, I think there's like a simplified way to think about it, which is like behavioral interaction with interfaces on the UX side versus purchase intent or attitudinal positioning on the market research side. But I don't necessarily believe that that's the way to divide them up. I think there's a ton of crossover. We had Jason Buell from Answer Lab give a talk about this at one of our like SoCal UX research nights like a year or two ago. I think he teaches UX research in a market research program at USC. So he has a great perspective on the kind of difference. So maybe I'll send you the link to the recording of his talk because he does a great job of getting into some of the nuance. Mm-hmm. But I do think that UX research is sort of like has a little bit more of like technological innovation attached to it. If you had to pick one of the differences, I think market research has a more traditional history in large companies of like, this is the way we do this. This is the kind of studies we run on our advertising and our marketing and stuff, and even our product positioning and our pricing and things like that. And so I think because of that, it's a much bigger industry. I think we're still a much smaller slice of the pie. I think there's a bigger spend on MR than UXR based on nothing. That's my guess. There's so much overlap. I think you have a ton of people now that, even in my brief time at Facebook, I saw lots of, UXRs kind of working with MR and vice versa. And I don't think it's as siphoned off as we might think.
I'm actually really glad you touched on that because that was going to be one of the things that I would ask is like, if any overlap exists between the two, because it would seem that you're doing a very similar job, but maybe for a different outcome, right?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the beating, pumping heart of whatever's driving most of the studies we all work on kind of comes down to like, will people buy this thing? Which is sort of closer, I think market research is closer to that sort of kernel. But then, if you're a research team or UX research team, you might get that distilled down into more product questions. Are they able to complete this flow or this aspect of our product or our interface? But so they're working towards the same goal, improving or building better things, whether or not it's to make more money, that's depends on the context. But every team I've seen or worked with that was only on the UXR side kind of deals with requests that are a little bit blurry. And each of those requests, a research request, like, hey, can we do a study where we just figure out, like, if we built a green box, would people buy that green box? And I've seen a lot of UX researchers get a little bit prickly and be like, I can't really tell you if people are going to buy it or not. That's not really my jam. If you have a prototype, I can test that. But I think there's tons of UXRs that do study design that still touches on purchase intent, and tons of market research for a fact that deals with interaction of some kind or behavior of some kind, for sure.
That's a really interesting take on that. I guess I haven't personally noticed that shift or hear, as you would say, UXers maybe get a little prickly and say, I don't know if that's really my scope of my job. What's interesting about that is it makes me think of Indy Young and her work and discussion of problem-based research. Because to me, that's kind of what you're trying to figure out in market research. Is it's not how can we improve this thing or how can we enhance this thing that we've already decided somebody should buy. But a lot of what I took away from her, in that work is understand the problem that is to be solved better. I think goes hand in hand with, is this a problem that's worth solving that no business can make money from, right? Because I think that actually a lot of people should probably embrace that a little bit more.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, and I think that you're absolutely right. And I love Indy's work so much. That probably just shows that there is a lot of overlap between the two fields. I mean, who knows? It's so dependent on the company and the team, and you're talking about agencies versus in-house. And I think all that makes a huge difference. But it's fascinating how much of that creeps into every research study. Is like, so, it's some stakeholder at some point, very often is like, I just want to know, is this going to be a success or not? It's like, well, I don't know. We're not crystal ball readers.
Yeah, totally. Again, I'm glad that you kind of touched on that, because there's a couple comments I've got with regard to that. So the first one is, I almost wonder if, because market research is trying to answer a more concrete question for the business as to why that might be, like you said, they're a larger slice of the pie. There's more investment goes into that. It's because people maybe understand the output a little bit better than UX are, if that's possible.
That's
and then the other part of that too is kind of, where I was going with it. I'm definitely showing my hand and my bias on this, but I tend to think that we as an industry ought to lean in to trying to hang our hat, not on metrics, but more concrete answers, not to be a crystal ball, but rather to say, well, the research we do can help you get an answer to the question you have, rather than just, I feel like there's different camps in UX and UX research specifically, where we want to be very careful of not being prescriptive to say, if you do this thing, you will get this outcome.
Yeah.
And then there's other people who go, well, we want to tell you we're going to do this research to help you make that decision directly. And I kind of think that we ought to lean into that a little bit more, because it would show more value in the work that we do.
Sure. And it's notoriously hard to quantify that value. I think everybody struggles with that. And one of the things that's so interesting is companies continue to invest so heavily in UX research and market research for that point. A lot of times internally, there's some pressure to say, like, prove your, impact. Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. But a lot of the magic that comes from understanding the context of people's lives and how they overlap with interfaces is hard to quantify. So it's a never-ending, tricky thing.
It is. I've never found a great answer to it, because I think it just doesn't exist. It's not that there's a lot of really smart people who've worked really hard to try to figure that out. I just think that answer doesn't exist,
Yeah. I mean, part of it is like saying, prove the value of seeing live music versus recorded music. You maybe can't prove that a live show can touch you in a certain way, even if it's the exact same song. But I think anybody that's been to a live music performance that touched them in some way or they connected to just knows that it's a bit different than listening to it at home. There's nothing wrong with recorded music, but that powerful connection that you get, you can build something on that. Just like if you talk to somebody that opens up some insight, or a series of people, there's something that happens there that's like powerful but hard to define. And I think companies struggle with that because it's not easily quantifiable.
I really appreciate the way you said that, and using the analogy of like live music, because listening to an MP3 as opposed to going to a concert, on paper, it's the same thing. It's the same song, it's the same lyrics. It should be, by all accounts, essentially exactly the same.
Right.
There is something very profoundly different, right? Of going to a concert as opposed to, hearing it on your music player of choice.
Yeah. And luckily that's not something that musicians, I don't think, have to quantify. Although I guess I just realized that ticket sales are probably the quantifiable metric that they have because they say, well, I sold 50,000 tickets. There's the proof.
Sure.
But, I think there is some kind of interesting correlation there in terms of qual insights, because they are a little bit tricky to say, well, we talked to all these people and we did all this rigor around our sampling and our methodology. And what we ultimately got were some moments that inspired us to think differently around the audience that we're trying to research. And that is inherently hard to quantify, but it is powerful.
Yeah, no question. No question. All right. So I'm going to take a little bit of a left turn on this because it's apparent to me, you and I, we've been acquaintances for a really long time. My point is you've been in the game for a really long time.
Yeah.
And I'm just kind of curious, like even to this day, what's the one mistake you see UX researchers making that you're just like, we got to get past this? What's this thing that all of us, right? Because there's a lot more people coming into the field. And I think that they could probably really benefit from your practiced hands and say, look, this is something I see all the time. Avoid this. It's, get that out of the way right at the beginning of your career.
Yeah, man, that's a great question. Let me think about that one for a second. One thing, well, first is just a caveat that, I spend most of my time working on Ethnio as like a, designer or PM. So I feel like I'm not doing a ton of research anymore, or not doing it well, that's for sure. So I think if I just think back though to when I was doing a lot of research or kind of working on those types of projects, I know what it is. And this is hard. There's no easy answer to this. It's finding the balance between packaging up your research in a way that can have an impact and having good rigor, because the two are sort of at odds with each other. It's like a yoga pose or something, like practice good rigor, but also put this together in a way that you can sort of present it and people will find it engaging and it will have impact. That's hard. I know that Cliff Klang, who just wrote this awesome book about, user research stories. I'm totally doing a terrible job remembering it, but he told me once in SF that he thinks researchers are secretly journalists, like kind of in denial, because a huge part of your job as a researcher is to get comfortable with figuring out the lead and the headline.
Yeah.
And that's oftentimes at direct odds with all the rigor that goes into conducting studies, mixed methods and doing everything right and doing it on a timeline that you can fit into your product development. Those things are kind of top of mind, and working with the team and the stakeholders. But at the end of the study, you do have to package it up into a way that resonates to get them in, to kind of pull people in, to be able to get into the rigor and the details, the complexity. Most researchers I know want deeply to walk through the complexity and really get into, this is where the nuance is. And I want to really get into this conversation around the nuanced findings, but you can't get there. You can't pull people in to that sort of pithy, headline. And that's hard. That's just hard. And I just see people not focusing as much on that because it feels like, well, I want to do the research. I don't want to waste time packaging it.
I love it. This is really good stuff. We've talked about this in a number of different ways. And I completely agree. I think the people who are in UX, and this isn't just researchers, but UX researchers too, tend to love their craft. And so they get really excited about that. And then they want to tell other people about their craft. But what I usually tell folks is, UX research, the output of that is an answer to a question. That's what it is. And the people want the answer to the question, not the Rube Goldberg machine behind the scenes of how we got there, right?
Unless it's a really cool machine though. Yeah.
Exactly. And there's some people who are really into that. And so really it's like know your audience. And that's kind of what you're saying. At least what I'm taking away from what you're saying is getting a good understanding to strike that balance of knowing your audience to be able to draw them in, so that you have the chance to talk about that craft and the nuance of it, if and where appropriate. But it's very, very difficult.
Because it feels like, I think they feel like they can be at odds. You could say well, I don't, what I care about is rigorous, high quality research. I don't care about headlines. And so I think that's what reminds me of this. Do these two things that feel opposite and do them well at the same time.
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I guess, do you feel like they, in reality, actually conflict with each other?
No. Yeah, great question. I mean, I don't think they do. But in terms of your time, you only have so much time. And that's something that I think we've all noticed is the pressure to execute these studies, especially for internal teams, but also for agencies and everybody. It's crazy. We need this done by tomorrow.
Yeah.
You're like,
Yeah, I've personally experienced that. I mean, I guess it makes me wonder, and I'll ask you because you're our guest. Do you think that there's ever a place to say, well, we're going to sacrifice a little on the rigor to get a great headline?
I mean, I think the reality is more gray area, that probably there are small sacrifices, maybe. I don't know that people would think about it as like, well, I'm going to sacrifice this giant piece of rigor to just get this out the door. But I think in the minutia of recruiting and scheduling and even non-automated, even self-moderated or whatever the type of methodology is, there's probably things along the way like, well, we're not going to do test as many components of our interface as we were, or whatever it is that, you end up, I think, scaling back as you get into it. You're like, okay, no time for that. Never mind.
Yeah. And even something you said there, it kind of gave me an idea. I've never thought of it this way before, but there's these two sliding scales, right? If you're dealing or working with a team, whether you're in-house or not, that is going to call you to the carpet on your rigor, then you probably ought to be spending more time there than spending more time on like having a good headline. But then on the flip side of that is true, right? Like it's these like two different equalizer buttons, like whereas the one side goes up, the other one kind of has to go down. But if the headline is really important and having an impact and being able to sort of draw people in and sell the outcome of that is more important, than you have to accept that you're going to have less time for this other thing, unless you're working for a place that just has a ton of time, money, and resources, which I've personally never experienced. So I can't believe that's the case for most of us.
Yeah, that's a great way of kind of diving into it more, because you do sort of remind me that the number one, we run all sorts of surveys from Ethnio customers just to asking about like, what are the biggest hassles you deal with? And one of the things we hear about all the time is defending research from people that don't agree with the findings. Yeah. I think that's a huge thing that researchers, whether you're a freelancer or agency or in-house, you have a PM or an engineer or a stakeholder, an exec that's like, I'm not buying it. Where did you find these people? How many people did you do? What's N? And they immediately go into the rigor as a way of questioning the validity of the findings if the findings don't fit well. And I've experienced that a ton of times. I think most people that have worked in the field have. And I get it. I mean, I think that makes sense. If you're like this, if you're a stakeholder and you're like, this smells funny, how could you possibly be saying that, everybody just, ate their whole orange? I don't believe people would eat the entire orange. That's crazy. You sort of want to get into like, how did you arrive at this conclusion? But it sort of then puts pressure on for you to have both the background, maybe the academic background, a PhD or whatever, to be able to defend it, plus the actual rigor in the study itself, plus maybe the structure of your entire team to say, this is how we create our operations and our projects in general to make sure that we find the right things. I think that's a massive part of people's day-to-day challenges doing research these days, is just to be able to defend well.
This is such a really interesting topic, and there's a lot of things I kind of want to ask you about and touch on with that. The first one is, I remember we had Peter Merholz on a long time ago, and I absolutely stole one of the things he said to me because I thought it put it so beautifully. It resonated with me because I realized I did the same thing. He always said, I take a very lawyer-like approach to design, where the whole process, you're essentially building this case. And then your final statement is like, look, I've already laid out all the evidence. Here's the thing that I'm telling you that I think that you should do. I've already given you all these breadcrumbs will lead you back to why this should be the case, right? I'm curious though, because we were also talking about market research. Do you see folks in market research having to justify this, having to defend those answers when in that kind of work as well?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know enough about the field. I just haven't seen it. I feel like I've heard stories here and there. Well, I'm sure it happens, but I have no idea.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it just makes me wonder. The reason I ask is because, as we've sort of discussed, it seems that market research, there's no seams about it. It has been around longer than UX research has, sort of officially, right? In name and sort of recognized practice, which just sort of leads me to believe that it hits some inflection point where people were like, well, this is just part of how we do business. I would argue that UX research is not broadly accepted in that way yet. And I'm just trying to figure out why. And I think that part of why some people probably have to justify their findings and sort of like really sell that more is because it's not just widely accepted as this is a way of doing good business now.
It's a great topic. It's so interesting. It's so rich because it's like pulling right at the strings of, what does UX research get you? Is it a formula for great products? I think we all know that it's a wonderful and rich field that cannot give you a 100% guarantee of building something phenomenal. And there are so many examples that we all know of products that never did a lick of UX research and are wonderful, and vice versa. And it's complicated. And so, because of that, it doesn't have an easy answer to, well, why should we do it? And it sort of touches on the culture of a company and what they value, and do they invest heavily in it? And it's just, such a fun topic with no real easy answer. But, maybe it's that market research is just closer to the pumping heart of capitalism of buying stuff. I don't know.
Yeah. No, that's really good. Your response made me think of something else too, because you said one of the pervasive things in our field is maybe you do great research, and then regardless of that, somebody says, I'm not buying it. I'm not picking up what you're putting down. I'm curious. So you also touched on company culture and what they value. Have you seen patterns there in terms of, hey, these types of companies, this type of culture tends to question that more, as opposed to maybe others they put their faith in UX research?
Yeah. Never found a correlation that I've really noticed held true. For a long time, I felt like, and I've heard this from a lot of other researchers too, like sort of design-oriented cultures or companies that aspire to have like a design-first approach tend to value research because so many designers value that, appreciate having that kind of input into their design process. But I think I've seen that be untrue just as much as it's true. There's like teams that are completely not design first that have phenomenally rich and successful research teams, and vice versa. So I feel like I've never over the 20 something years I've been doing this noticed a correlation that's stuck that says like this kind of company value tends to do really great research and tends to have really great products. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, it's absolutely true based on the experience that I have too. Not quite as long as yourself, but it is interesting, even just reflecting on some of my own personal experiences where I've been on teams that had 20 plus designers and researchers on it, and we still had those challenges. And then on the flip side, I've been part of teams that this was brand new and people were just really hungry for it. And they're like, great, let's do more of it. We love what this is helping us inform and how to make our decisions and stuff like that.
Yeah. it is interesting. It kind of reminds me on an individual level, creating buy-in for research is one of those popular challenges too. If you're trying to convince, especially if you're an agency or a freelancer and you're trying to sort of sell research as part of the process, I think it can be a huge challenge. And it's like, I always just, Sid Harrell, who I worked with for years and just does great work in the civic, just had a new book on the civic tech space. She always says, and this is something we used to say a lot, I think is so true, you have to just do it and have people attend. There's no other way to sell people on the power of those, at least qual sessions than just having them watch. And it's such a fascinating thing. Why is that? Why is it so hard to sort of create buy-in for qual, at least? It's just fascinating. I don't know.
Yeah, I've experienced that. I think, and you reminded me of something else that I have tried to practice in my past, is that I feel like getting people to want to trust or accept those findings and outcomes from research happens well before you ever do any research. For me, it's always been about establishing really good relationships with your business partners, your stakeholders, even executives, honestly. Making it really clear, like, here's what I'm here to do and how I can actually help you. Here's how I can be valuable to you. This is what you should expect from me. And then when that time comes, it's not a surprise and it's not like a new thing where all of a sudden, well, you're telling me what to do based on research you did, but like, who are you again? And tell me about your process, right? Like you've already had that conversation. You've already said, here's how we're going to go about this. This is how I want to be able to help you in our organization. And then maybe the expectations are set where there's less of a question about that.
Totally. Yeah, no, I think you're right. And it's a lot easier to get somebody to attend your first session if you have built a good relationship first.
Yeah, that's another really great point too, because I think it's always a challenge. I think, and Jared has talked, Jared Spool, for those just unclear, but he's talked about this for a long time too, where it's like, do these kind of like field trips, make it a team sport and get everybody to watch it. But yeah, you're not going to get somebody to attend a meeting who they don't even know who you are, right?
Yeah,
it doesn't matter what kind of meeting it is. You throw something on their calendar, everybody's busy. Most people don't like meetings all that much. And so just another one to add to the pile. And it's like, well, who is this? And why should I attend this?
Yeah.
You're kind of starting, 2 steps back as it is.
Totally.
I'm curious, out of everything that you've seen and still working deeply in the space, even though you may or may not be doing, research every day anymore, where do you see us going from here? Like what is UX research going to be in the next year or 3 years?
That's a great question. I see it expanding still, which is I think, surprising to my 10-year ago self more than anything. Because
Okay.
I felt sure many, many years ago, man, this is it. Like, it can't possibly get any bigger than it already is. And then it has just exploded since then. So I definitely keep seeing it increasing, which is a funny element to what we were talking about earlier of like, what is the, how are people pressing up against demonstrating value? I mean, it's obviously valuable because companies continue to invest in it and teams keep growing and the volume, quantity of research, quant and qual keeps growing too. So there's clearly a thirst. Erica Hall talks about this in so many wonderful ways too. There's a thirst for like a human voice that comes from all corners of big companies and small companies. That people do want to feel more connected to the people they're building for. And that's a real human desire. We want to connect and we want to understand, I think, for the most part. And so providing that voice, it just becomes more and more critical, whether that's through, metrics or through qual sessions, that's all painting a sort of picture. And I just think that we'll see more creativity with the way that happens. Obviously, things will get faster. That's just the nature of the beast. And, there'll be more tools and more options. But I just see that growing above all, which is still crazy. But I think that's how it's going to go.
Yeah, really well said. I've seen some of the patterns of that myself too. So it's an interesting perspective. It also kind of reminds me of, you mentioned, Bolt Peters kind of acqui-hired by Facebook way back in the day. And I mean, here's the thing, everything's going to get faster. They coined the term move fast and break things, right? So, at this point,
nothing went wrong there. No consequences. Everything's all good.
Exactly my point, right? And yet the duality of that is that they invested so heavily and they took on a company that specialized in UX research,
Yeah.
So it's like, what are we talking about with that? And I think it's a useful question to maybe ask of somebody like yourself who you were there to see some of the inside of that. I think it's very well documented at this point. Hey, we shouldn't just move fast and break things. And I think part of why we see UX research growing is because of that realization, but also even just like ethically, civically, we all, I think, as an industry and as a society, recognize the need more than ever of being mindful of each other because of our connectedness. Yeah. So I don't know what my question is there, but I guess I just wanted to float that by you. As someone who's sort of seen it.
Yeah, and I share your interest in that kind of tension, and I think there's just probably a lot of us think about this all day now because there's so much going on where we're like, if any of us work in technology, are we accidentally destroying democracy? Like, does the whole information wants to be free thing? There's just so much writing and so much work right now going into like, what have we done? What is the true impact of this stuff? My undergrad major at UC San Diego was called the social impact of digital technology. And I don't think even that was 1999. So, oh my God, however many years ago that was, I wasn't that rah-rah about it. I think a lot of us have been skeptical about what the potential downsides of these things can be. But what we're living through right now brings everything into such scrutiny because we're like, oh my God, like, have we built structures that are dismantling, what we previously thought of as shared information and democratic ideals. And, I think that actually hopefully will lead to us coming to a better place. And maybe one of the reasons why I've stayed working in UX research for so long is because I find that giving people a voice is of merit, no matter what we're building, and finding diverse voices. And that's probably why I still work in participant management stuff too, is like finding the right participants for any given context to share their voice is still, I think, an inherently good thing. Could be wrong, but that's what I believe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is it's a big, very important topic that's also very timely right now. And I think a lot of folks are looking into it. It's not one that we should skirt talking about. And refreshingly, I've seen our industry be very open and eager to sort of hash through this stuff. I don't think there is any answer to it right now, other than to say, honestly, as UX people, as UX researchers, we should have a big voice. And frankly, we have a direct and big responsibility to act as a voice of reason and consideration on some of those things because, I think what got us there, and maybe this is what you were referring to. So, correct me, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the whole idea of move fast, break things, or just let's get answers to questions on how we can make the thing more desirable and more people willing to buy or use or click or do this or do that, without actually thinking of the long-term ramifications of that. That is our responsibility. It's not our fault in every case, but it is our responsibility, right?
Yeah, for sure. And there was the UXR Conf keynote, Zakai, that I'm sure you saw and a lot of us saw, was just such a wonderful kind of discussion of that, of like, these are the ethical responsibilities that UX researchers have. This is where we're failing, forcing white supremacist structures. And just because we're not knowing what the potential future output and consequences could be, doesn't give us an excuse not to do better. So I completely agree. Yeah,
I agree. That's a big focus of where we are. Not new responsibility, but maybe one that we've become more aware of. And I think that that's just a good thing. I think it will continue to improve from there. I'm hopeful that it will.
Yeah, same.
For sure. We covered a lot of ground in our chat, and we're coming up. I need to be respectful of your time. And one of the things I'd like to ask at the end of sort of every episode is I ask our guests, if I forgot everything we talked about and somebody came up to you and said, "Hey, Nate, what was the podcast all about?" How would you answer that question? How would you summarize it for them?
Oh, man, that's a great way to frame it. I think what pops out first in my mind is we talked a lot about details of remote research and traditional UX research and then overlap with market research. But I think the meat of it was around valuing the work that we do in UX research and communicating that value to other people well so that you can continue to do it.
Nice. I like it. Is there anything that you want to share with folks that we didn't get a chance to talk about today?
No, I mean, we were talking about this at the beginning, but I think I love that you do these podcasts and always happy to jump on and Zoom with you and love what you guys are doing at Aurelius. And, it's just fun to chat.
Right. Nice. I'm very appreciative of you taking the time and doing this. It was an awesome conversation. I know people are going to have a lot to take away from this and very timely stuff from somebody who's been in the field for a long time. So I appreciate it on behalf of everybody else. Thanks again for jumping on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. Pleasure.
Awesome. All right, everybody. We'll see you next time. This podcast is brought to you by Aurelius, the research and insights tool that helps you analyze, search, and share all your research in one place, so you can go from data to insights to action faster and easier. Check out Aurelius for yourself with a 30-day trial by going to aureliuslab.com. That's AURELIUSLAB.com. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean a lot if you would give us a review on iTunes to let others know what you think. You can catch all new episodes of the Aurelius podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts like iTunes, Spotify, and more. Stay up to date when new episodes come out by signing up for email updates on our website.